Hey folks, welcome to your second lesson in the Waves and Sound unit. This time we're going to be building on our foundational knowledge of waves and focusing specifically on sound and sound waves and how they work. So some major goals for this lesson, we're going to talk about some various characteristics of sound waves, like what type of wave they are, frequency, pitch, blah, 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 and kind of relate that back to our understanding of waves from before and talk about how those different qualities are related to each other. We'll look at a couple of unique features of sound and sound waves in particular, like the Doppler effect and sonic booms, and how those are kind of cool. And then last thing we'll talk about is something called beat frequency. So what is it, how is it created, and how do we go about calculating it? All right. So first of all, just basic stuff on sound waves. Hopefully you remember from our last lesson that sound waves are longitudinal waves. And in particular, they're caused by a vibrating object. So when an object oscillates back and forth, it causes the particles of air around it to oscillate back and forth, and so forth and so forth. That energy spreads along with this constant back and forth vibration until it reaches whatever it is that's actually hearing that sound. So for example, when you strike a tuning fork, obviously this animation is completely overblown compared to what's actually happening. But in fact, when you strike a tuning fork, what you're causing it to do is the two tines kind of vibrate back and forth, and so they vibrate the air and it hits your eardrums, and life is great, right? Now, there are different types of sounds that we hear. In particular, we are particularly able to hear difference in pitch, especially important for all you music people. So the way that we get different pitch is by changing the frequency of these vibrations in the object. So if we have an object that's vibrating at a very high frequency, lots of oscillations per second, we perceive that as being a higher pitch. And if something's oscillating at a lower frequency, we perceive that to be a lower pitch. Now, just to let you know, the range of frequencies that we are able to hear as human beings generally falls between 20 and 20,000 hertz. Now this range will naturally shrink a little bit as you get older, which is why like your parents aren't able to hear the same very high pitches that you're able to. So just over time that range diminishes, but that's sort of an average range that we're able to hear. Just to give you a sense of what those frequencies actually sound like to us. In that very low range, 32 to 512 hertz, we're talking about bass notes, the very lowest things that we hear. Typical human speech falls in the 500 to 2000 hertz range. One thing that I found really interesting when I was doing some research for this is that the letter S is at a much higher pitch than the rest of your speech. And like if you try saying it, you can't really do like a low-pitched S. Like it always comes out like S, like really high. I don't know. I think that's cool. And then also up in that higher range, we get bells and cymbals and other very high sorts of instruments. Now, you may have heard before of people having perfect pitch. The idea behind that is that pitch and frequency are very closely related, and that higher pitch means higher frequency. But pitch is a more subjective interpretation of that frequency. Pitch is what we hear the frequency to be, whereas frequency is like what it actually is, how quickly the vibrations actually are oscillating. So when you have perfect pitch, what that means is that your ear is perfectly calibrated to identify exactly the frequency that those vibrations are occurring at. Just FYI. Right. So those are the range, that's the range of frequencies that we're able to hear. Obviously there are other animals that can hear other ranges as well. So elephants, for example, can hear lower frequencies than us. Dogs, thanks to dog whistles and stuff like that, they can hear higher frequencies. Again, why dog whistles work. They emit a sound that's at a frequency that's above 20,000 hertz, too high for us to hear, but dogs can hear it, and it's very unpleasant for them. Poor things. Aside from being able to, annoy dogs and stuff like that, this kind of information is also useful for medical technology. So if you've heard of like ultrasounds or sonograms, for example, the reason that these are used, especially to take a look at fetuses in pregnant mothers, is that basically what they do is they shoot very high frequency sound waves at the uterus, and the way that those sound waves bounce back and reflect, we're able to get an image of the baby that's inside. But this is all done without us being able to hear it because that frequency is outside of our audible range. So we're shooting really, just frankly, super high sounds at the uterus. The way it bounces back gives us an image, and this is all done through totally harmless waves that, you know, are not radiating, ionizing, anything like that. It's just very, very safe. Okay. Sound waves, pretty useful. Okay. Now obviously sound, like any other wave, travels at a certain speed. If you recall, the speed that a wave travels at depends only upon the medium that it's traveling through. So the only way to change the speed of sound is to change the medium that you're sending that sound wave through. And in particular, since sound is transmitted through the vibration of particles, any medium that allows efficient vibration of particles will allow sound to travel faster. So a few different factors that can affect that speed of sound. First is state of matter, and this one's kind of funny because people will tend to assume that gases transmit sound better than solids can, but it's actually the other way around. We're actually better able to transmit sound through solids than through gases. This is sort of the basis of that whole telephone made out of 2 cups and a string idea, is that actually the string is much more efficient at transmitting those vibrations than the air is. Or for example, if you've ever seen anyone like put a glass up to a door to try to hear through it, it's because that solid glass touching the door is better able to transmit those vibrations than the air that's touching the door is. So state of matter certainly makes a difference. The density of a material will affect the speed. In particular, more dense materials will transmit sound faster, because since the particles are so tightly packed together, it's easier for them to collide and pass those vibrations along. Next thing that makes a difference is temperature. Obviously, as temperature increases, things move faster, so that further facilitates the transfer of that sound energy. And then the elasticity of a material, the more elastic it is and able to move, the better it'll move sound through. Okay. Just in case you're curious, the speed of sound in air is typically about 760 miles per hour. So when we talk about things breaking the sound barrier, which we will be talking about in just a moment, they're moving pretty darn fast. Now, to change gears just a little bit, I'm sure you've had that experience where you're driving in your car and you hear the sirens and you're like, do I pull over? Do I not pull over? I can't tell where it is. And probably one of the major ways that you determine whether it's getting closer to you and you need to think about pulling over, or whether the emergency vehicle is moving away from you, in which case you're probably fine, is by the loudness of it. And that's obviously one way to determine if it's getting louder, it's probably coming towards you. But actually, it turns out you can also listen for changes in the pitch of that siren. All right, so, whoops. Just to demonstrate this for you, we've got someone who took some video footage of a fire truck that was coming along. So listen closely to the pitch here. Oops. All right. So, what you should have noticed, I really hope you noticed, is that it sounded pretty high, that siren, and then right as it passed us, it suddenly got lower. We sensed this drop in pitch. And it's not because the fire engine itself obviously like changed the sound that it was emitting. The change came from our relationship to the sound waves and our stance as observers listening to those waves and what was happening to those waves as the source was moving towards us or moving away from us. Okay, this is known as the Doppler effect. Okay, and that's this just perceived shift in frequency based on whether the source of the wave and the person hearing it are getting closer together or further apart. If they're getting closer together, the frequency sounds higher to us. If we're moving apart, then the frequency sounds lower. And you can kind of envision this using this little picture right here. We've got a police car that's emitting these sound waves. And as the police car is moving forward and emitting the sound waves at the same time, we can almost imagine the sound waves kind of getting scrunched together here on the right as the car is driving forward into the same waves that it already just emitted. So the waves kind of get scrunched together, which creates this higher frequency. We're getting more waves in a given amount of space. Whereas back behind the car, where it's moving away from the sound waves that it's emitted, it gets more spread out, which is why it sounds like a lower frequency, a lower pitch to us. Now, if you want to kind of see this a little bit more, interactively, we've got a little applet here. And we have this little dot that's emitting a sound. And we'll have the sound waves going, All right. So there it goes. And at each second, when it's emitting the wave, it's emitting the wave equally out in each direction. But then it's moving basically into the waves. And causing them to compress where out in front of it and spread out behind it. Now, some funny stuff kind of happens as our object moves faster and faster. So I'm going to restart this. Okay. And get it to move really fast. Okay. So notice how at this point my source is moving faster than the speed of sound. And what we see happening then is as it's emitting these waves, they kind of all pile up on top of each other, all the new ones and the old ones. We get this big pile of waves occurring. Okay. Now what we call that is a shock wave, if you ever heard of that. That's just this idea of all these different waves constructively interfering with one another, basically. And then we hear that then as a sonic boom if we are, in an area where we can hear things that are exceeding the speed of sound. So, in case you've never heard that, so yeah, it's really quiet for a while, and then when all of those waves hit us at the same time, it's this really loud, intense noise called a sonic boom. Speaking of intense, right? I'm sure that you have noticed that things that are closer to you sound louder and things that are further from you sound quieter. Duh. The basic reason behind this is as a sound wave spreads out, from its original place, it kind of gets thinner because it's trying to cover more area. It's kind of like the same way that when you blow up a balloon, it starts off feeling pretty thick, and as you blow it up more and more, the rubber gets thinner and thinner and thinner as it's trying to cover more surface area. Same idea with a sound wave. As it moves out more and more, it gets more spread out, which is why the intensity decreases the further away it gets from its original source. Okay. And that intensity we perceive to be loudness. But what's kind of interesting is that loudness doesn't directly correlate with intensity. It actually follows a logarithmic scale. Okay. Now, I'm not going to have you do a bunch of log stuff, but just to kind of orient you to what this means. We can measure the loudness of something using a system called the decibel system. So we define 0 decibels to be where we can't even hear things anymore. 120 decibels is like, ouch, it hurts. And then there's a bunch of stuff that falls in between. For example, a quiet whisper is 20 decibels typically in loudness, whereas a conversation held at a normal volume would be 50 decibels. So you might think that a normal conversation then is 2.5 times louder than a whisper is. But again, this is actually based on a logarithmic scale, which means for every 10 decibel increase we have in loudness, the loudness actually doubles. Okay, so when we go from 20 to 50 decibels, from a quiet whisper at 20 to a normal conversation at 50, we don't just get 2.5 times louder. We double 3 times, 2 times 2 times 2. That's 8 times louder for a normal conversation than for a quiet whisper, which is why it's very important that when your teachers tell you to whisper, you actually do so, because that adds up. Last thing to talk about is something called beat frequency. And this is probably something that you've kind of picked up on if you've ever been sitting in traffic waiting to turn, and you have your turn signal on and the car in front of you has their turn signal on, and your turn signals aren't quite synced up. What you'll find is that there are some times when they're like completely opposite of each other, and then sometimes when they're both blinking together. And that drives me crazy, but whatever, I'm kind of weird. So this beat frequency is something that arises when we have two different sounds that are both being emitted at the same time, but they have similar but slightly different frequencies. Okay, and to find the beat frequency, which is sort of the frequency that we see in terms of the loudness or softness naturally occurring from the overlap of these two sounds. We can calculate that frequency by just subtracting the two frequencies of the two waves. So for example, if I have a 300 Hertz sound wave and a 303 Hertz sound wave, both going at the same time, I would just subtract those two. I get a beat frequency, so another perceived frequency of 3 Hertz. Now, just to kind of visualize this for you a little bit better, we'll actually get to experience this in class soon. But we can kind of imagine drawing out these waves. Now, I know that these are transverse and sound is longitudinal, but it's just easier to envision this way, so we're going to go with it. Up at the top here, we have our two different sounds with slightly different frequencies. So you see right here in the middle, they're perfectly lined up and they look like they're the same frequency, but then they get kind of off of each other, and the problem just seems to get worse and worse and worse. So what we have is this weird pattern where, like in the middle here, we have perfect constructive interference. But then as we get over onto the side, we eventually hit a point where we reach perfect destructive interference. So then when we add up those two waves, we get a pattern kind of like what we see down here in the middle, where we've got this destructive interference, and then it gets louder and louder and louder until we finally hit this constructive interference, and then back down again. Creating and defining a whole new wave with a frequency equal to the beat frequency. I know that was kind of abstract, but we'll talk about it more in class. That's all I have for you guys. Have a wonderful day.